She thought she knew what I'd leave behind. My daughter, Carla, always so sure of herself, stood in that church hall bragging about her inheritance like the matter had already been settled, as if love could be measured in square footage and bank balances. But what she didn't know was that the will she never bothered to read held something far more powerful than she expected. Not a twist for revenge, not a cruel joke. Just the quiet truth of a life lived with intention. And the footnote that changed everything. This isn't a story about money. It's about presence, absence, and what we choose to carry forward. Join us as we follow the final months of a woman who decided that legacy wasn't something given, it was something revealed. The folding chairs in Fellowship Hall always wobbled, no matter how carefully they were unfolded. Mine creaked beneath me as I leaned forward to pour myself another cup of weak coffee from the scratched metal urn. Around me, voices murmured and laughed, the familiar chorus of our small church after Sunday service. Paper plates sagged under the weight of deviled eggs, carrot sticks, and an enthusiastic number of store-bought cookies. Across the room, children darted under tables while their parents tried not to spill Jell-O salad on the hymnals. A ritual I knew well when I'd come to look forward to more in recent years. There was a comfort to it, a rhythm, like the creak of old pews or the soft rustle of pages turning in unison during the final hymn. I wasn't eavesdropping, not exactly. But when your own daughter's voice rises above the rest, bright and laughing, it catches your ear, especially when she says your name. I mean, it'll all be mine eventually. Mom doesn't have much reason to hold on to the house now that she's not driving anymore. The lawyer says it'll go straight to Mino, probate, mess, or anything. She said it with that same tone she used as a teenager when showing off a new jacket. Casual, a little smug, like something shiny she assumed she already owned. I didn't turn around right away. Just stared down at my half-eaten slice of lemon cake, its frosting smeared across the paper plate like a careless afterthought. There were 3 women gathered near the punch bowl with my daughter, Carla, all about her age. One of them, Samantha, I think, laughed a little too hard and said, "Well, you deserve it, hun. You've been looking after her, right?" Looking after me? That part stuck? Carla had driven me to 2 doctor's appointments in the past 6 months. She'd canceled the 3rd when her book club ran late. When I'd needed help setting up my new phone, it was my granddaughter, Lucy, who sat with me patiently, not Carla. But Carla was very good at performing care when it suited her, especially when an audience was present. And it's not just the house, Carla continued. There's her little savings account, a life insurance policy. Nothing huge, but it adds up. My brother already said he's not interested in fighting me for any of it, so I guess I'm lucky there. My knuckles went white around my styrofoam cup. Not because of the money. I'd never cared much for sums or stocks. What's the presumption? The way she spoke of me as if I weren't still breathing and serving green bean casserole 3 tables over. As if I weren't still here, still lucid, still hers. I finally looked up and she caught my gaze across the room. Her smile faltered. For a split second, then reappeared, brighter and tighter. She gave me a small wave, wiggling her fingers like I was a child peeking through a curtain. I nodded once, slowly, then turned back to my table. I didn't need to hear the rest. I already knew the script. Carla had been planting seeds like this for years. To her friends, her coworkers, even to our pastor once, after service. She always framed it like concern. "I just want to make sure everything's in order for when the time comes," she'd say. Like I was a package being shipped off, I suppose. I should have confronted her directly. Should have said something sharp and firm and final. But I'd learned the hard way that Carla never heard what she didn't want to. Not unless it came in a form she couldn't ignore. So instead, I sat. Let the sounds of laughter and clinking plastic forks wash over me. Let her assumption dangle in the air like a decoration hung too early. Let her enjoy the imagined prize for now. What she didn't know, and what no one in that crowded church hall knew, was that the will had already been rewritten months ago. I'd driven myself to the lawyer's office, thank you very much. Wobbled in with my cane and my thermos of tea and my copy of the original draft tucked into my handbag like a loaded weapon. We'd sat down in a room with bookshelves that smelled like dust and pine cleaner. And I'd watched the lawyer's eyebrows rise when I explained my intentions. "Are you certain, Mrs. Elwood?" he'd asked. "I am," I'd said. "And I'd like a footnote added, one she'll have to read out loud." Back in Fellowship Hall, I folded my napkin neatly into my purse and stood to leave. Carla didn't notice. She was too busy explaining which bathroom. Renovations she planned for my house. She wouldn't understand the footnote until it was too late. And that was the point. The first time Carla asked about my will, she didn't ask. Not really. She hovered around the topic like someone dipping their toe into a cold lake, circling, glancing, pretending she wasn't interested, all while making it clear she very much was. We were sitting in my kitchen. It was a Tuesday morning and early. March, the kind that still clings to winter's breath, even though the sun pretends otherwise. I'd made tea and opened a box of shortbread cookies from the tin she'd brought me at Christmas. She didn't touch hers. Instead, she stirred her tea without drinking it, eyes darting around like they were searching for something worth mentioning. Eventually, she set the spoon down with a deliberate clink and said, "Have you ever thought about getting things in writing, Mom? You know?" For peace of mind, I reached for a cookie, broke it clean in half. "What things?" She gave a small performative laugh, as if I were being adorably naive. "Oh, your affairs. The house. Medical stuff. It's not about money or anything, it's just being prepared." It was about money. She'd been circling my house like a realtor in waiting ever since her divorce. She and Mark had bought a 2-bedroom condo during the market peak and walked away underwater when it crumbled. Since then, she'd rented a townhome and called it temporary, but 5 years in, she still hadn't left. I knew the glint in her eye when she looked at my property, the sunroom I built after retiring. It's the backyard that bloomed in spring with the tulips her father once planted. She looked at it like it was hers already, waiting for the keys to change hands. "I've thought about it," I said, wiping crumbs from the table. "Why?" "No reason," she said too quickly. "It's just what responsible families do." The strange part was, she didn't ask what I wanted. She never said, "Mom, what matters most to you? Or is there anything special you'd like us to remember?" She never mentioned the old bookshelf in the den that her father built, or the quilt my grandmother made, or the letters in the cedar box under my bed. She wasn't curious about legacy, only logistics. Later that afternoon, after she'd gone, I sat in my armchair with the television off. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that lets old thoughts resurface. I thought of my son, Alan. He hadn't been. Buying a while busy with the kids and his job at the power company, but when he did visit, he never once asked about my will. He brought soup, cleared the gutters, changed the smoke detector batteries. Small things. Things that said, "I see. You now, not just what you'll leave behind." Carla didn't see me. Not the full me. Not anymore. When I drafted the first version of my will, everything was divided equally. That's what I thought fairness looked like. 2 children, 2 halves, no favorites. But over time, I began to understand that fairness and equity are not always the same, that showing up counts for something. That kindness in the quiet years should matter, just as much as caretaking in the loud ones. The final straw came the day she brought me a brochure for a retirement community without asking if I wanted one. It was glossy, expensive, and smelled faintly of perfume. I flipped through it in silence as she sat across from me, telling me how vibrant and social these places could be. "You'd love it there," she insisted. "They have art, classes, and bingo. It'd be good for you." "I teach art classes here," I reminded her, "and I've never once liked bingo." She didn't respond, just kept smiling that tight smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. That evening, I called the lawyer and scheduled a revision. It wasn't spite. I want to make that clear. Wasn't trying to punish her. Was simply tired of being spoken about instead of spoken to. tired of being managed, navigated, and nudged toward a future someone else had chosen for me. When the lawyer asked if I wanted to notify my children of the changes, I said no. Let them find out in due time. Let the footnote speak for itself. Carla never asked again after that. She assumed, like always. And I let her. Some truths I've learned are better delivered on paper. Carla always knocked too hard. 3 sharp raps, like she was announcing a package, not visiting her mother. Even before I reached the door, I knew it would be her. No one else had that same impatient rhythm. It was a Saturday afternoon in early April, the trees just beginning to blush with green. I opened the door to find her already halfway turned toward her car. Arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. "You said 2. She reminded me before I could say hello. It's 2:06. I stepped aside and let her in. Time got away from me. She glanced around the living room like she always did, like she was taking mental inventory of what still existed. Her eyes flicked to the old piano, the clock over the mantel, the framed cross-stitch above the couch. She didn't comment on any of them, but I felt her assessing. Carla had developed a habit of treating every visit like a subtle appraisal measured. Efficient, always in motion. She set her purse down with a sigh. "So, what did you need help with?" I hadn't asked her to come over. Not this time. But I didn't argue. I offered her tea, which she declined, and then busied myself at the kitchen counter just to have something to do with my hands. Over the past few years, I'd started to notice things. Not big things, not shouting matches or slammed doors, but little shifts. Changes in tone, in posture. In the way she said "Mom" with just a touch of sigh at the end, as though even the word was an obligation. Once, when I tripped on the back step and scraped my elbow, I called her not for help, just to let her know in case I needed to reschedule something. Her response was flat. "Are you going to the hospital, or can it wait until after my meeting?" I'd laughed it off at the time, told her it was nothing. But that tone had stayed with me longer than the bruise. Another time, I left a message just to check in. No crisis, just a hello. She didn't call back for 3 days. When she finally did, she opened with, "Sorry, it's been a week," and then launched into a story about work without ever asking how I was. It's a strange thing, realizing your child has become someone you wouldn't choose to know if you met them as a stranger. There's guilt in that, a deep kind. The kind you stir into your coffee in the morning, trying to dissolve it. But there were still flashes. Glimpses of the little girl I remembered, knees scraped from the playground, hair in lopsided pigtails, bringing me dandelions like they were priceless gifts. I clung to those flashes when I could find them. They came rarely now, usually through Lucy. Lucy, my granddaughter, would visit after school sometimes. She never made a production out of it, just came in, hugged me tight, and sat cross-legged. On the rug, flipping through old photo albums, she once found a picture of Carla at her 7th birthday party, grinning through missing teeth, cake on her chin. "She looked happy," Lucy said. "She was," I answered. I didn't say the rest. Out loud that I didn't know when the change had happened. That somewhere between teenage rebellion and middle-aged certainty, Carla had stopped listening to me as a person. I had become a role, a responsibility, something to manage. She never asked what I wanted for my last years, never asked what made me feel alive or safe or proud. She asked what I needed when it was convenient and interpreted silence as agreement. And I let her. That's the truth of it. I let her because I thought maybe she'd come back around. That if I didn't press, if I kept things smooth and polite, we could avoid the kind of fracture that doesn't heal. But fractures grow quiet. Once especially, when Carla left that day, she barely looked up from her phone as she waved goodbye. I stood at the screen door watching her car pull away. Then sat down with my tea and looked at the room she'd just swept through like a gust of wind. Still, quiet, untouched. There was a time I would have cried after visits like that. Now I mostly just sat. A few days later, I pulled out the folder with the latest version of my will. flipped to the back page where the footnote sat, simple and sharp. I reread it and smiled. The stuffing was dry. Not terribly, just enough that I made a mental note to add more broth next year if there was a next year. Carla had insisted on hosting, though the invitation had come with more of a directive than an offer. "You'll come to me this year?" She'd said over the phone. "It's easier that way." It's easier for whom? I wondered. She had a kitchen twice the size of mine, but used it half as often. Most of the meal had been catered. I could tell by the uniform cut of the carrots and the way the mashed potatoes held a perfect scoop, like school cafeteria trays. Still, I said thank you. I always did. The dining room was crowded with people, half of whom I barely knew. Mark's sister and her new boyfriend, Carla's neighbors, a coworker or two. Alan and his family were at the other end of the table, politely smiling through it all. His youngest, Elsie, passed me a napkin when she noticed I'd dropped mine. She did it quietly, without fanfare, just a gentle kindness. It nearly undid me. Somewhere between the cranberry sauce and the pumpkin pie, the conversation turned. It always does. One minute we were talking about holiday travel, and the next Carla was detailing her latest plans for Mom's place. "We've been looking at remodeling options," she said, lifting her wine glass. "Eventually, when it's mine, I want to open up that sunroom and maybe extend the back deck." She said it lightly, like it was theoretical. But the way her friend chuckled and nodded told me this wasn't the first time she'd mentioned it. I didn't say anything. Alan glanced at me, his brow furrowing slightly, then looked back down at his plate. His wife Dana placed a hand gently on his arm. A silent nudge, maybe, or a warning not to get involved. Mark, who was still technically Carla's ex, but always found his way back around the holidays, raised his glass. "Sounds like a solid investment," he said. "That house will be worth a fortune in a few years." I took a sip of lukewarm coffee and watched the condensation trail down my water glass. No one asked if I planned to live there another 5 years. No one asked what I wanted the house to become. They'd already drawn their conclusions. After dessert, I excused myself and stepped out onto the back porch. The evening air had a bite to it, sharp and still. I could hear the muffled clatter of dishes through the sliding door behind me, laughter echoing off the kitchen tiles. The sound didn't warm me. It felt distant, like a radio playing in another room. Lucy found me a few minutes later. She didn't say anything at first, just leaned on the railing, sighed me, and looked out at the bare trees silhouetted against the fading light. "You okay, Grandma?" she asked eventually. I smiled, or tried to. Just needed a bit of quiet. She nodded. "They're talking about the house again," I figured. Lucy hesitated. "You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to." That was the thing about Lucy. She didn't say much, but when she did, she cut straight to the root. I looked at her and saw more compassion in those 15-year-old eyes than I had in most adults twice her age. "I know," I said. She reached for my hand, small and steady in mine. Later that night, back in my own home, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the photo on the dresser. It was an old one, Carla and Alan, his children, squinting in the sun beside the rose bushes their father had planted. Carla must have been 8 then, all knees and elbows and missing teeth. I traced her smile with my eyes, wondering when that girl had vanished. I opened the drawer and pulled out the letter I'd written, the one tucked inside the envelope marked "To be opened after my passing." I reread it, just to be sure. The bottom, beneath my name and date, I'd written in small, careful script. Inheritance is not just about what is given, but about what was earned in kindness, presence, and respect. Okay. This isn't punishment. It's clarity. I folded it back into the envelope and slid it beneath the will. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. It wasn't anymore. It wasn't said in anger, not at first. That would have been easier to forgive. It came out in a moment of frustration, sharp and unguarded, like a thorn beneath velvet. We were in the parking lot of the pharmacy mid-July, the sun bearing down like it had something to prove. Carla had taken the day off to drive me to a follow-up appointment. She reminded me of this 3 times before we'd even left the driveway. Inside the store, she'd waited by the entrance, scrolling on her phone while I navigated the aisles. My knee had been acting up again, bone on bone, the doctor said, and no real fix unless I wanted surgery. I'd refused. Too many risks. I just needed a refill and some topical cream. Nothing urgent. By the time I got to the register, she was already checking her watch. "We're going to hit traffic," she muttered as I handed over my prescription card. "Then we'll sit in traffic," I replied. It was the kind of exchange we'd had dozens of times before. But on the drive home, something shifted. The air in the car was thick with silence. I watched the blur of trees through the window while Carla tapped her fingers against the steering wheel. "I just don't get why you didn't do this last week," she finally said. "I wasn't feeling well last week. Well, now I'm behind on everything." She huffed, louder than necessary. "Work's been insane. And Mark's dragging his feet on refinancing the condo. And Lucy needs a new laptop for school, and I'm playing chauffeur to every little thing you forget. I'm tired of dragging dead weight." It landed between us with a finality that took my breath away. Not shouted, not spat, just like fact. I stared at the glove compartment, afraid that if I looked at her, I'd unravel. Oh, she must have realized what she'd said because she sucked in a breath. "I didn't mean yes," I said quietly. "You did." The car slowed to a stop in front of my house. I didn't move right away. My hands were still folded neatly in my lap, fingers locked tight. I stared at them, spotted and pale, veins like faint rivers beneath the skin. Hands that had buttoned her coats, wiped her fevered forehead, packed her lunches for 12 solid years without complaint. She didn't say anything else. I opened the door, stepped out slowly, carefully, as if my bones were glass. She didn't offer to help. I didn't expect her to. The porch steps groaned under my weight as I climbed them, one at a time. The heat clung to my blouse, sweat prickling at my collar. When I reached the front door, I paused, not to look back, but to breathe. Just breathe. The next morning, she called. "I'm sorry," she said. I was overwhelmed. I could hear her trying. Her voice softened just enough to show effort. But apologies without understanding are like wallpaper over mold. They look fine until the damage pushes through again. "I know," I said. "We all get overwhelmed." I didn't mention what she'd called me. Neither did she. That was our rhythm. We avoided bruises until they faded enough to forget. But I didn't forget. Not really. That afternoon, I found the folder again. It's the one with the documents. I added a note, not legal, just personal, and annotation in my own handwriting on the back of the last page. I wrote, "There were words spoken that day in July I cannot unhear. I don't need retribution, but I do need truth. Let this serve as a record not of punishment, but of memory." I slid the folder back into the drawer beside my bed and closed it softly. Later, when Lucy came by to drop off a book she thought I'd like, I asked if she had time to stay for a while. She did. We sat in the sunroom reading quietly together, her foot resting against mine under the blanket. She never once looked at her phone when she left. She kissed me on the forehead and whispered, "See you tomorrow, Grandma." Tomorrow. That word mattered more than any apology. Every Tuesday at 9 sharp, I wheeled my little cart across the cracked sidewalk leading to the Rosewood Community Center. The wheels always caught slightly on the uneven patch near the entrance, but I'd learned to give them a little nudge just before the bump. Inside, the building smelled like floor wax and old bulletin boards, the kind of smell that doesn't change no matter how many windows you open. Room 3B had yellow linoleum tiles and a wall of mismatched windows that let in too much light in summer and too little in winter. The folding tables were scuffed from decades of use in your luncheons, church drives, chess clubs. But on Tuesdays, they belonged to us, by us. I mean the 8 or so regulars who came to the beginner's watercolor class I taught each week. Some came because they'd always wanted to learn. Others came because they didn't want to be alone. And a few came because they liked the way I made coffee, which I brewed from home and brought in a dented thermos with chipped enamel flowers on the side. There was Helen, who painted every dog she'd ever owned in a single chaotic swirl of color. Earl, a widower who claimed he couldn't draw a straight line, but somehow always ended up painting the most delicate, aching trees. Sheila, who brought in old postcards and tried to replicate them stroke by stroke. No one painted particularly well, but that was never the point. They called me Miss M, even though I'd told them a dozen times to use my first name. Stuck, the way nicknames do when spoken with affection. They saw me as someone useful, someone with something to offer. It was a feeling I didn't always have in my own home. One Tuesday, after class, Earl lingered while I rinsed brushes at the utility sink in the hallway. His voice was soft but sure. "Did I ever tell you," he said, "that my wife used to paint?" I shook my head. "No, you didn't. She wasn't good." He smiled, "but she loved it. Said it was the only time her hands felt steady." We stood there for a minute, the silence easy between us. "She passed before I could tell her that her paintings made me see our home differently," he added. "Funny what you remembered too late?" I nodded, because what do you say to something like that, except maybe, "Thank you for telling me"? On the walk home that afternoon, my knees ached in the familiar way they always did after I'd been on my feet too long. Still, I took the long route through the park. The cherry blossoms were starting to fade, and their petals blanketed the path like snow. A young couple passed me with a stroller, lost in their own world, and I watched them for a moment, not with envy, but with something gentler. A kind of nostalgia that didn't hurt anymore. When I got home, the light on my answering machine was blinking. One message. It was Carla. "Hey, Mom, just checking in. I need you to send me the login info for your bank app again. I tried the old password, but it's not working. Also, we need to talk about power of attorney stuff soon. Okay, bye." There was no greeting. No, "How are you?" Just tasks, as USUALI erased the message. Then I sat down at my desk and took out my journal. Not the one I kept for daily notes or recipes, but the one where I recorded the things I wanted remembered. Today's entry was simple. Taught Earl how to paint light, filtering through trees. He said it reminded him of his wife. Carla called about passwords. Sometimes I wondered what Carla thought I did with my days. She imagined me sitting in the dark waiting for someone to check in. She didn't ask. She never asked. But here's the truth. My life was still happening whether she noticed or not. I was still showing up, still creating, still making coffee for people who cared if I was there. And on Tuesdays especially, I remembered what it felt like to be seen. The lockbox wasn't anything special. It's just a plain steel container, no bigger than a shoebox, with a simple key latch. And a worn sticker from a hardware store long since closed. I kept it on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, tucked behind a quilt I hadn't used in years and an old purse I hadn't carried since before. Frank passed. Inside the box were papers, some important, some just sentimental. The deed to the house, birth certificates, the faded marriage license from 1972 still folded along its original creases. A photograph of Frank in his Navy uniform, the edges curling like dried petals. And, more recently, the revised version of my will, the one with the footnote. I'd taken my time writing it. Not the legal document. That part was handled quickly, efficiently, with the help of Mr. Halpern. It's a quiet, deliberate man whose law office sat between a dry cleaner and a barber shop. No, the part that took time was the letter. The one meant to be opened only after I was gone. It started with Lucy's name. "Lucy, sweetheart, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you. But I hope you're still carrying the light you've always had." I hadn't told anyone I was writing it. Not Ellen, not even Lucy. I didn't want input or interruption. Not long considering. It covered a lifetime, but long enough to say what needed to be said. I wrote about Carla. I wrote about how proud I had been of her once, how clever she was as a girl, how she had a gift for storytelling and a stubborn streak that, when softened by compassion, had once made her a force of nature. But somewhere along the way, the compassion thinned, and the control grew. I wrote, "This decision isn't made in anger, Lucy. It's made in clarity. I am not leaving everything to your mother, not because I want to punish her, but because I want to honor who was actually present, who saw me, who understood that love, at its core, is not measured in tasks performed, but in tenderness extended." I explained the clause, the small, easily missed line that redirected the majority of the estate. A legal footnote with emotional weight. I remembered how Mr. Halpern raised an eyebrow when I requested it. "You sure you want to be that direct? I've spent 80 years softening the truth for other people," I told him. "I think I've earned the right to be clear." He didn't argue. After signing everything, I made 2 copies. One for the lockbox, one sealed and given to him for safekeeping. Back home, I sat on the edge of my bed with the letter resting in my lap. The room was quiet, the kind of stillness that arrives not with loneliness, but with certainty. I thought I might cry while writing it, but I didn't. The tears had come earlier in smaller moments. After phone calls that left me empty. After visits that felt more like evaluations than connections. This wasn't grief. This was peace. I placed the letter in a cream-colored envelope and addressed it by hand, for Lucy. After Dot, then, I tucked it behind the revised will in the lockbox and turned the key. That night, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the rooftops. Somewhere down the street, wind chimes sang in the breeze. I thought of Lucy, of how her eyes always searched mine when she spoke, as if trying to listen for more than what I said. She would read the letter one day. Maybe not with understanding at first, maybe with pain, but eventually with knowing. Not all inheritances are material. Some are a final reminder of who we really saw, who saw us. The first time I met Mr. Halpern, I almost turned around and left. His office was tucked between a failing tailor shop and a shuttered nail salon on the edge of the older part of town. The sign above the door had lost half its gold lettering, and the bell over the entrance gave a sound like a cough when I pushed the door open. Inside smelled faintly of paper and time. Not the sterile scent of corporate buildings or the coffee on fabric softener air of waiting rooms. But something older something lived in. A file cabinet in the corner was propped up with a paperback book. The carpet had worn thin in a footpath. From the desk to the door, he stood as I entered, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses always tilted just slightly, like one arm had been bent at some point and never fixed. He didn't apologize for the state of the office. He just gestured to a chair and said, "Mrs. Elwood, I've got you down for 10 a.m. I liked that about him immediately. No small talk, no rehearsed smile. Just business offered without condescension. I explained why I was there, that I wanted to revise my will, that I didn't want a standard arrangement, that I wanted clarity, not fairness for fairness's sake. He listened quietly, the kind of quiet that doesn't interrupt. He didn't take notes at first, just watched me with a steady patience, like someone who's heard every kind of story but still gives each one a proper hearing. "And you're sure about this?" he asked once I'd laid it all out. "I've been sure for a while," I said. "It just took me some time to put it on paper." He finally opened a file folder and began writing in tidy block letters. I noticed his pen was old-fashioned, a fountain pen that left a soft, deliberate trail of ink. "I'll need to see the old will," he said. "And if you're adding a clause, I'd suggest we word it carefully. Some people don't take surprises well." "That's the point," I said. "It's meant to be read, not avoided." He looked up at me then, over the rim of those crooked glasses, and I saw something that resembled approval. Not warm exactly, but respectful. "We'll draft a footnote that carries weight," he said. "Not legally it won't change the distribution, but emotionally. She won't be able to miss it." I nodded. That's all I need. We worked in companionable silence for a while. He asked questions sparingly, just enough to make sure there were no contradictions, no gaps. He didn't ask why I was changing things, not directly, but he did ask about Lucy. "She's your granddaughter," he said, scanning the notes. "She is, and you're confident she's the right person too. Carry this forward?" Then confident. That was the only part I didn't hesitate on. By the time we were done, the new documents had been signed, witnessed, and filed. He slid a copy into a manila envelope and handed it to me like it contained something fragile. "I'll keep the original here," he said, "and you keep this safe. And if anyone gives you trouble after the fact, have them call me." I almost laughed at that, picturing Carla, red-faced, trying to argue with this unbothered man in his worn cardigan and leaning file cabinet. "Thank you," I said. He nodded, then added, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Elwood, I think you've done something very brave." "I don't feel brave," I admitted. "You don't have to. The paper doesn't know the difference." I left his office feeling lighter than I had in months. The sun hit the sidewalk outside with the same harsh light it always did, but it didn't bother me as much that day. I stopped at the cafe on the corner and treated myself to a lemon square and a cup of black tea. Just because the folder stayed in my purse for 3 days before I moved it to the lockbox. I saw Mr. Halpern once more after that, to update a few small details, and when I entered the office, nothing had changed. Same leaning cabinet, same slanted glasses, same fountain pen, waiting patiently on the desk. But this time, when I signed my name, I felt something settle inside me. Not pride, not vindication, just steadiness. Like I had finally said what needed saying. And written it in ink no one could erase. It didn't look like much, sitting there on the last page. A few lines in smaller print tucked beneath the final signature line like an afterthought. But I knew better. I'd written every word myself. And I'd chosen each one the way you choose words when you don't get another chance to explain. The clause wasn't legally necessary. Mr. Halpern made that clear. The distribution was already laid out, percentages, names, conditions. Was all airtight, immune to contest unless Simone wanted to waste a lot of time and money on a battle they'd lose. The clause wasn't about legality, it was about voice. Mine, we called it a statement of intent, was written in first person, separate from the formal legalese of the rest of the document. The formatting made it easy to skim past unless you were really reading, which of course was the point. It began simply, "To whomever reads this, especially my daughter Carla, let this note serve as the clearest expression of my wishes and the reasoning behind them." I remember how strange it felt sitting at the dining room table, drafting it with a pen that stuttered every few words. My hands aren't what they used to be, but I wanted it in my own handwriting first before Mr. Halpern typed it up. I wrote about presence. I wrote about dignity. I wrote about how, in the final stretch of a person's life, it isn't who calls most often or shows up for holidays that matters, sees who sees you, who listens without rushing you toward the door, who brings warmth into rooms growing colder each year. I didn't use accusations. I didn't dredge up every slight or failure. That wouldn't have served anyone, but I told the truth, softly, clearly, like water carving a path through stone. This decision was not made in bitterness, but in balance, I wrote. The things we pass on should reflect more than blood. They should reflect love given, attention paid, and care returned. One included a line for Lucy, just one. "To my granddaughter, you saw me." That was enough. I remember the pause I took. After writing that sentence, the way I held the pen above the page, breathing in the quiet, felt like closing a door I'd waited too long to shut. Mr. Halpern added it to the official draft with no edits. "Sometimes," he said, "a footnote is the only part people remember." It gave me comfort knowing that even if Carla skipped the rest, glossed over the itemized bequests, and tried to fast forward to the part she assumed was hers, she'd still have to pass that paragraph. She'd still see it. And maybe in that brief moment, she'd realize the story she'd been telling herself didn't match the one I'd lived. I didn't expect her to understand. Not fully. But I wanted her to hear me, even if it was after I was gone. To feel in those few sentences that she had missed something. Not the money. Something far more costly. One morning, not long after finalizing everything, I pulled the document out again. I sat in the kitchen with my tea and read it aloud to myself. Just once. Not to rehearse, not to memorize. It's just to feel the weight of it. When I reached the footnote, my voice caught not because I was unsure, but because I was sure. That night, I slept deeply. Sometimes, when I pass the lockbox now, I run my fingers across the shelf above it. Not to check, not to worry. Just to remember the words are there, waiting, small as they carry everything. It was a warm day for October, the kind of weather that made you second-guess pulling your sweaters out of storage. I'd planned to start sorting the attic weeks earlier, but something always got in the weight-tired knees, cloudy mood, a book too good to put down. But that morning, something in me shifted. I wanted to see what was up there. Needed to, really. The attic stairs groaned like they hadn't been used in years, though I knew better. I went up once a season just to make sure nothing was leaking or nesting. But I hadn't really looked. Not closely, dust floated in the air like memory. And the boxes were exactly where I'd left them, stacked neatly. Each one labeled in my handwriting. Christmas, school papers. Frank's tools, Carla and Alan. Photos, I started with the smallest. It was a shoebox filled with birthday cards. Some yellowed at the edges, others still crisp. Most of them were from Frank's handwriting, large and uneven, like he'd never quite learned to write gently. There was one from Carla, age 11, where she'd drawn a cartoon version of our family on the front. Inside, she'd written, "To the best mom ever. I'll take care of you when you're old. Promise." I held it in my lap for a long time, my thumb tracing the loop in the word promise. What a strange thing to promise a person before you even know what it means. Before you know how heavy care can be when it's not carried with love. In another box, I found the quilt my mother made. It was frayed in places, but still smelled faintly of cedar. I laid it across the attic floor and sat on it like we used to during picnics. Felt like visiting a version of myself I hadn't seen in a long time. Toward the back of the attic was a bin I hadn't opened since Frank died. Inside were keepsakes, his high school yearbook, a cigar box full of foreign coins, a Zippo lighter he never used, and a set of letters we wrote while he was stationed overseas. Some were silly, some solemn, all full of a kind of tenderness we rarely voiced in person. As I read one aloud, his handwriting cramped from writing in a tent. Somewhere far too hot, I thought about the strange ways we live on, not through money, not even through the houses we leave behind, but through the things people find in boxes. Years later, when they're trying to understand who we really were. By me afternoon, my knees were beginning to protest, and the light through the attic window had shifted to a soft gold. I packed things away slowly, placing certain boxes closer to the front and leaving others for later. One box, marked to keep, held a few items I planned to bring downstairs, a photo of Lucy as a baby in my arms, the quilt, and a book of Pint. Poems Frank had given me the year Alan was born. Before I left, I slid the will folder into a different spot, tucked behind the box marked Photos. I wasn't hiding it, just protecting it. I wanted Lucy to find it if she came looking. Carla wouldn't think to look behind anything. She'd go straight to what was labeled. She always had Dot at dinner that evening. I made soup and set one bowl aside in the fridge. Lucy often dropped by on Wednesdays. She liked my lentil soup, said it reminded her of summers we spent cooking together when she was small. I'd always let her stir, even when she splashed half of it onto the counter. I thought of that while folding laundry. The hum of the dryer grounding me in something real, Life was still happening. In between appointments and silences and clauses and footnotes, I was still here. Later, as I slid the attic ladder back into place, paused, resting my hand against the cool wood. There were things up there Carla would never see. Not because they were hidden, but because she never looked long enough. Boxes aren't just storage. Sometimes they're stories. And sometimes they're boundaries. And I'd just redrawn mine. It started with a brochure. Glossy, 4 panels, professionally printed with stock photos of elderly people smiling beside koi ponds and rose bushes. Carla brought it with her one afternoon, tucked neatly into her leather tote bag. Nestled between her phone charger and a water bottle she never remembered to refill, she placed it on my coffee table without introduction, like an offering. "What's this?" I asked, though I already knew. She smiled, too wide, too rehearsed. "Just something to think about. A friend from work moved her mom into this place. Said it's lovely, clean, safe, friendly. They do yoga and art classes, even cooking demos." "I still cook," I replied. "I know," she said quickly. "Of course, it's not about now, it's just for the future. Options." I picked up the brochure. The people in the photos were all too happy, too tidy, like they'd been airbrushed into contentment. One woman had a small dog on her lap and a man beside her with a chessboard, grinning at her like he didn't just lose his queen. "I'm not ready for this," I said. "It's not about readiness," Carla replied. "It's about planning. You hate stairs, your knees hurt. What if something happens and no one's there? There are grab bars in my bathroom, and I have neighbors." Sighed Mom, and there it was. The tone. The shift from suggestion to strategy. Her hand moved the brochure slightly closer to me, like I hadn't noticed it the first time. "I know this house means a lot to you," she continued, "but it's too much. It's too much upkeep, too many risks, and it's isolated. No one wants to think about what happens when I think about it." I interrupted. "It's probably more than you do." She blinked, thrown off balance for a moment. I stood slowly, letting the ache in my left hip remind me of every mile walked, every floor mopped, every set of stairs climbed in the quiet parts of my life. "This isn't about safety," I said. "It's about control." "It's not fair," she replied. "Too fast, isn't it?" I asked. "You brought this without asking. You didn't say, 'What do you want, Mom?' You said, 'Here's what I think is best. For you. Your schedule, for your convenience.'" Her lips pressed into a line. "I'm just trying to make things easier. For whom?" She didn't answer. The rest of the visit passed in a strained blur. She talked about Lucy's school schedule, her job, a new project at work. I nodded when appropriate, offered her tea. She declined, and pretended not to notice when she checked her phone twice during our conversation. When she left, the brochure stayed behind. Whether by accident or design, I couldn't say. I tossed it into the kitchen recycling bin without ceremony. Its pages crumpled like dry leaves. That night, I lay in bed longer than usual, eyes fixed on the ceiling fan, spinning quietly in the darkness. I thought about control, about how it seeps in slowly, masked as care, disguised as planning. How easy it is to confuse love with management. Frank never tried to manage me. Even when I was pregnant and stubborn and determined to shovel the driveway myself, he never barked orders, simply held the other shovel and said, "I'll do the heavy part." That's what partnership looks like. That's what I had hoped to teach Carla. Somewhere along the way, that lesson got lost. The next morning, Lucy stopped by on her way to school. Her hair was damp and she smelled like peppermint shampoo. "You okay, Grandma?" I nodded. "Your mother came by yesterday." Her expression shifted just slightly, but enough to register. "She brought me a brochure for a retirement home." I added. Lucy groaned. "She's been looking at those online for weeks." I smiled faintly. "I know." She pulled her backpack higher on her shoulder. "You don't have to go anywhere. You're still sharp as ever." And if I weren't, then we'd still talk about it together. not like a project. That word together settled something in me. I reached for her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "I'm not going anywhere just yet," I said. "Good," she replied. "The world's still better with you in this house." After she left, I retrieved the brochure from the recycling bin and fed it through the shredder. One page at a time. The koi pond, the rose bushes, the smiling seniors all reduced to ribbons. Sometimes planning isn't kindness. It's erasure dressed up in good intentions, and I had no plans to disappear quietly. Lucy had her father's eyes, but she used them like her own. Where Alan's gaze was gentle and measured always steady, always calm Lucy's carried more. Light, there was curiosity in it, sort of quiet searching that made you feel seen, not just looked at. She didn't speak as much as Carla had at her age, but when she did, she said things that stayed with you. She came by often, not always, with a reason. Sometimes it was just to sit on the couch and do her homework while I peeled apples for a pie or folded laundry. She never needed entertainment, never reached for the remote or sighed at the quiet. She brought her presence like a gift, placed softly on the table, no ribbon required. I remember one visit in particular. It was late September, and the wind had just started to carry the scent of dried leaves and chimney smoke. Lucy came in carrying a worn canvas tote and a cinnamon muffin she'd picked up at the bakery 2 blocks away. "I got you one too," she said, handing me the warm little parcel like it was gold. We sat in the sunroom, side by side, the light catching her hair in copper streaks. She was working through a reading assignment for school, something about civic responsibility, and asked what I thought made a good citizen. "Someone who notices things," I said, "not just rules, people." She considered that quietly, pen tapping against her notebook. Then she said, "You know, Grandma, I notice you." I blinked, surprised by the simplicity of it. Not because it was untrue, but because it had never been said out loud. "I notice when you look out the window too long," she added, "and when you make a second cup of tea but don't drink it. I notice when you hum while folding sheets." "And when you stop humming, too?" My throat tightened. Not from sadness exactly, but from the kind of affection that arrives when someone touches a part of you you'd almost forgotten was still visible. "You have your own way of being in the world," she said, "and I like it." I didn't answer right away. Just took a sip of tea and watched the shadows stretch across the room. There was nothing performative in her words. No need to impress. Just truth, offered gently. After she left, I found myself lingering in the places she had been, her empty mug on the table, the faint scent of cinnamon on the cushion where she'd sat. I realized then that the reason I'd chosen her in the Wilf, the reason I'd written her name first, even before the house, wasn't because she'd earned it in some material way. It was because she'd made me feel real. When I wrote that letter, the one tucked behind the will, I started with her because she started with me. Every time she visited, she brought pieces of me back into the present, not as a task, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. Carla once told me Lucy was too soft for the world, that she'd need to toughen up or get swallowed whole. But I didn't see softness in Lucy. I saw strength. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that holds steady in silence. She didn't need to raise her voice. She saw things clearly and she responded with kindness. That's a kind of power most people underestimate. That same week, I slipped a note into the box marked for Lucy. Just a few lines folded neatly around an old photograph of the two of us at the state fair, her riding my shoulders at age 5. Both of us grinning like fools. The note said, "You've always seen me. I hope you never forget how to see others too. That's your gift, Lucy, and it's rare." The more I thought about it, the more I understood that legacy isn't just about what we leave behind. It's about who remembers us in full, not just as a parent or a title or a task, but as a person, a whole one. Lucy did that. She saw the pauses, not just the sentences, the gaps in conversation, not just the words. And somewhere along the way, her eyes became the mirror through which I remembered who I'd always been. I wasn't invisible in her world, That mattered more than any footnote. It came on a Wednesday just after noon. It's a kind of hour where everything in the house is quiet, the morning chores are done, the soup is simmering, and the world feels distant. Like it's waiting politely outside the windows. I was sitting at the kitchen table, dicing carrots, the radio murmuring old jazz standards behind me. When the phone rang, I nearly didn't answer. I thought it might be Carla again, following up about some form or reminder I hadn't asked for. But it wasn't Carla. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar at first. Polite, professional, a nurse from Dr. Temple's office. She asked if I had a few minutes to talk about the results of my last scan. She used the phrase, changes in your blood work. Then came words like follow-up, further evaluation, and potential referral. I held the phone between my cheek and shoulder, the knife still in my hand, a half-cut carrot resting on the board. My other hand trembled slightly, though I didn't notice it until I saw the tiny pieces of orange slipping from the blade. When the call ended, I stood in the kitchen a moment longer, unsure of what to do next. I wasn't afraid, not exactly, but I felt unsteady, as if the floor beneath me had shifted just enough to change how the world tilted. I poured the soup into containers and set them aside. I wiped the counters, even though they were already clean. And then I went to the bedroom, pulled down the lockbox, and opened it. Everything was in order. The will, the letter, the footnote, all exactly as I'd left them. I didn't add anything. That day, I just looked. I sat on the bed and held the folder in my lap like a book I wasn't ready to read but couldn't ignore. That night, I didn't call Carla. I didn't want to hear her solve me like a puzzle. I didn't want timelines or logistics or the soft condescension she thought I couldn't detect. I just wanted a moment to understand it myself, so I called Lucy. She answered on the second ring, a little breathless. Hey, Grandma. Everything. Okay? I didn't tell her everything. Just said I'd had a call from the doctor and I might need some more tests soon. She didn't rush to fill the space with reassurances. She just said, do you want me to come by? And then, do you want me to just be there? I said yes. She arrived 40 minutes later with a bag of scones and a paperback, novels she'd already read but thought I might like. We sat in the sunroom, watching the lights soften on the garden, and talked about nothing in particular. She told me about a poem she'd memorized in English class. I asked her to recite it, and she did, half shy, half proud. Her voice wavered on one of the last lines, and she laughed. I always mess up that part. It's a beautiful thing to get wrong, I said. The next morning, after she'd left for school, I pulled out the notepad I kept in the drawer beside the bed. I wrote a new page. It's not part of the will, just a note. Today, I felt the shift. Not panic, not certainty, but the sense that something has started to close. If this is the beginning of the next part of my life, I want to enter it on my terms. Not managed, not boxed up. Not pre-decided by someone else's calendar. I folded the paper and placed it behind the will, not replacing anything, just adding to it a new layer of voice. In the days that followed, appointments were made. Scans were scheduled. Carla, when she eventually found out, insisted on attending the consultation. She brought a notepad and interrupted twice to ask the doctor to clarify something he had already said clearly. She referred to me in the third person. Even though I was sitting right there, she just wants to be sure she's doing everything right. She said at one point, looking past me, she hates uncertainty. I'm doing fine with uncertainty. I replied, it's people talking over me I struggle with. She didn't respond to that later in the car. She asked if I'd thought about updating the will just in case. It's already updated, I told her. She didn't ask how, and I didn't offer. Some decisions don't need discussion. They need to be written plainly, tucked into envelopes, waiting just in case. It was raining the morning the will was read. The kind of rain that doesn't thunder or shout, just falls steadily, soaking the sidewalk, humming against the windows. I'd always loved that kind of weather. It made everything slower, quieter. As if the world was being asked to sit still. And listen, Prescott and Finch was an old building with tall ceilings and heavy wood trim. The sort of place where whispers seemed to linger in the corners and the leather chairs gave a polite sigh when you sat down. The room they used for family readings was small, lined with bookcases that held legal volumes no one had opened in years. There was a faint scent of lemon polish and old dust. Carla arrived first, as I knew she would. She wore a navy suit too sharp for morning, her heels clicking confidently across the floor. She carried a folder, though I doubted it had anything she needed. Carla always brought paperwork to things that made her feel in control. Alan came next, less formal, a pressed shirt, no tie, rain clinging to his sleeves. He gave the receptionist a kind smile and sat down with his hands folded neatly in his lap. His wife, Dana, sat beside him, holding his arm in a quiet, unobtrusive way. They weren't the sort of couple who made a show of affection. They just moved in rhythm. Lucy came last, slipping into the room with a book under her arm and damp hair, pulled back loosely. She didn't say much, just nodded at Alan and gave Carla a cautious glance before sitting in the seat beside her father. Mr. Halpern stood as the last person entered. He adjusted his glasses, still tilted, still never quite straight, and began with the same preamble I imagine he gave at every reading. The name of the deceased, the date the will had been signed, the confirmation that all necessary witnesses had been present. No one interrupted. Even Carla remained silent, her leg bouncing under the table, the only sign of impatience. When he began reading the actual contents, the room became noticeably still. To Alan. He read, I had left several family heirlooms, pieces that mattered. To him, things I knew he'd recognize without being told why. A small painting Frank had loved. It's a carved music box from my grandmother's house. And the fishing rod we used to bring to the lake every summer, even after he stopped fishing and just came for the view. To Lucy. There was more. Mr. Halpern read her name slowly, like it was something sacred. To my granddaughter Lucy, he said, I leave the full contents of my personal savings account, the house at 413 Bingham Avenue, and the accompanying letter enclosed with this document. Carla blinked, then laughed. It was a small, sharp sound, like the snap of a twig. There must be some confusion, she said. She's a minor. You can't just leave her the house. I'm her mother. Mr. Halpern looked over the top of his file. The house will be held in trust until Lucy is of legal age, with Mr. Alan Elwood named as the trustee and interim caretaker. All stipulations are legal and binding per the revised document dated 7 months prior to Mrs. Elwood's passing. Carla's mouth opened, then closed. Her folder, still unopened, slid slightly across the polished table. What about me? She asked, not angry. Not yet. Just stunned. Mr. Halpern turned the page, found the clause. To my daughter Carla, he read. I leave the photograph album from her childhood, which contains images of a time when love did not have to be earned through documentation. I hope it reminds her of what was once freely given. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of every assumption Carla had carried into that room. She didn't speak again, not immediately. Alan reached for Lucy's hand under the table, and Lucy squeezed his fingers. Then Mr. Halpern cleared his throat. There is one final note, said. A footnote added at Mrs. Elwood's request. Carla sat back in her chair. Eyes didn't blink. Please continue. Alan said gently. Mr. Halpern nodded and turned to the last page. The rain outside fell harder now, tapping steadily on the glass, like it, too, was waiting for the next part. Mr. Halpern's voice was always steady, but in that moment something in it changed. Not hesitation, exactly, more like carefulness. As though he understood that what he was about to read wasn't legal filler or a polite closing. It was the part I had written with the most intention. The part that wasn't about money or property or division. It was about truth. He cleared his throat softly and adjusted his glasses again. This footnote, he said, was dictated directly by Mrs. Elwood and entered into the official record as a statement of intent. I have been instructed to read it aloud in full. He glanced briefly at Carla, who sat impossibly still. Then he began, "If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here to explain myself in person. So I'll say it as plainly as I know how. What I've chosen to leave behind, and to whom, is not a reflection of hierarchy, obligation, or punishment. It is a reflection of who showed up, who saw me, who sat quietly when I needed company, and listened when I had things I wasn't sure I could say out loud." I had written those words late at night, the lamp by my bedside casting long shadows across the page. I'd rewritten that first sentence 3 times before settling on those exact lines. They were soft but firm, not an attack, not a defense, just a boundary drawn in ink. Mr. Halperin continued. "Carla, my daughter, you were born with every good hope I had. I raised you as best I could. I cheered for you in school plays, stood by you during your divorce, and sat up nights when you cried on the phone and wouldn't say why. But somewhere along the way, your care turned into management, and eventually absence. You began speaking about me more than to me, making decisions as if I were already gone." The room remained silent. Even the rain seemed to hush. Carla's eyes were fixed straight ahead, unmoving. "This isn't written in anger," Mr. Halpern went on. "It's written in clarity. I did not withhold from you. I did not erase you. I simply gave to those who gave me back pieces of myself when I felt most unseen." He turned the page slowly, the rustle of paper sounding louder than it should have. "To Lucy, you never treated me like a task. You treated me like a person. You never once asked what you would get when I was gone. You asked what I needed while I was still here. This world may try to convince you that kindness is a weakness. Don't believe it. It's the rarest kind of strength." Alan let out a breath, one hand still on his daughter's. Carla blinked rapidly, her face unreadable. Not grief, not yet. Something harder to name. Disbelief, maybe? Or the slow onset of realization. Like watching ice melt, but only from the edges. Mr. Halpern finished. "I leave behind this house not as an asset, but as a place of memory. I leave behind my savings not as reward, but as recognition. And I leave this letter not to wound, but to explain what I never found a gentle time to say. Okay? You cannot inherit love retroactively. Okay? You cannot claim care in past tense. I hope in time you will understand." He closed the folder gently. "That concludes the footnote." He said no one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Like something holy had been set down on the table beside the coffee and the clipped tones of old grief. Carla sat back in her chair. Her face had changed. There was no rage, no sudden protest, just stillness. She looked for the first time in years, like she didn't know what to say. And that, perhaps, was the most honest thing she'd ever offered. Alan nodded slowly. His eyes were damp but not crying. He leaned toward Lucy and whispered something that made her smile faintly. Mr. Halpern folded his hands. "If there are no questions, this concludes the formal reading." No one moved. For several seconds, all that could be heard was the low hiss of rain against the windows and the ticking of the clock on the wall behind him. Carla stood up, eventually. She didn't take her folder, didn't offer a final word. She simply walked to the door, paused just before opening it, and looked back toward the table. Not at Alan, not at Mr. Halpern. At Lucy, there was something fragile in her eyes, something too late. Then she left. Lucy reached for the letter Mr. Halpern slid toward her, still sealed, still crisp. She ran her finger along the envelope's edge and tucked it carefully into her book bag. No one needed to say anything. The footnote had already spoken. After the will reading, a drive home felt longer than usual. The rain had softened into mist, and the windshield wipers whispered instead of swiping. Alan offered to take Lucy to dinner, just the two of them, but she asked to go straight home. She needed time, she said. Time to think. He understood. Carla didn't call that night or the next. For someone who had always believed the house would pass seamlessly into her hands. The reality of the inheritance skipping her had landed like a door, quietly closing in a hallway she thought she'd owned. The legalities were clear. Mr. Halpern had ensured that the house and the savings were placed into a trust in Lucy's name to be released when she turned 18. Alan, as trustee, was granted authority to maintain and protect the estate. Carla wasn't listed on any paperwork, not even as an emergency contact. She found that out a week later after making a polite but persistent call to Mr. Halpern's office. According to his assistant, Carla had spoken crisply, with a kind of tone that walked the line between indignation and forced civility. She requested clarification on whether there had been a mistake. The assistant told Mr. Halpern afterward. When I assured her there wasn't, she said, "Interesting," and hung up. Interesting. That was Carla's favorite word when the world didn't bend to her expectations. What followed was a silence so loud, it echoed through every corner of Lucy's world. She didn't hear from her mother for 4 days, not even a text. Alan tried reaching out once, but the call went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Meanwhile, Lucy came to the house more often. She didn't change anything. Didn't start redecorating or moving things around. Instead, she cleaned out the garden bed I'd left untouched last fall. She dusted the bookshelves I'd always meant to get to. She made tea in the chipped blue kettle that still sat on the stove, and sat on the sunroom floor with her legs crossed. It's just like always. One afternoon, she found a box tucked inside the guest room closet. It was labeled in my handwriting, "If she stays." Inside were simple things: a house key, a letter, a folder with maintenance schedules and bank contact numbers, and a small locket containing a photo of her as a baby on one side and one of me holding her beaming in a hospital gown on the other. Alan watched her open it. He didn't speak. "She meant me," Lucy said, almost in a whisper. "Not Carla, me." He nodded. She always knew. There was no gloating in her voice, no smugness, just quiet recognition. A bridge she hadn't expected to walk across, but now found herself on. That same week, Carla showed up at Alan's doorstep. She didn't call first. She just appeared on the porch wearing a gray coat and carrying a folder of her own. They spoke on the front step. "She's 16, Carla said. "She can't manage a house." Alan remained calm. "She's not managing it. I am, for now." Carla's mouth tightened. This was supposed to come to me. Alan didn't respond right away. He looked out across the lawn, the late autumn. Leaves scattered across the walkway, and then back at his sister. "She didn't think you'd care for it," he said softly. "Not really. Not in the way she wanted to be remembered." Carla flinched at that, just slightly. "She made a mistake," she said. "No," Alan replied. "She made a choice." There was no argument after that. Carla left. She didn't slam the door or raise her voice. She just turned and walked down the steps, folder in hand, and disappeared into the rain. Lucy didn't ask what was said. Alan didn't volunteer it. Some things don't need repeating. Instead, Lucy focused on the house. She cataloged the books, made a list of repairs that would eventually need to be made, and folded a fresh set of linens in the guest room just in case. She didn't move into my bedroom. She left it untouched. But she opened the curtains each morning and closed them each night, as I had done for years. It wasn't about ownership to her. It was about guardianship. One night, Alan found her sitting in the living room, the letter I had written to her open in her lap. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. "She didn't just give me a house," Lucy said. "She gave me the truth." Alan sat beside her and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "She gave you a legacy," he said. "And you're already honoring it." The estate hadn't skipped a generation out of spite. It had reached for the one person who saw it for what it was, a home, not a prize. And Lucy understood, even at 16, that some inheritances are earned quietly, long before any document is signed. Lucy waited 2 full days before opening the letter. It sat on her desk, untouched, the envelope thick and cream-colored with her name written in my handwriting. Careful, the way I always wrote when something mattered. She'd picked it up a dozen times, turned it over, held it like a fragile thing. Hadn't opened it? Not yet. On the third evening, just after dinner, she sat at the kitchen table with the light low and the window cracked open to let in the cool air. The smell of rain still lingered from earlier in the day. She placed the letter flat in front of her and opened it with a butter knife. Slow and steady, dot inside were 4 handwritten pages. She read the first line 3 times before moving on. I hope you read this when the house is still quiet, when the world feels gentle enough to hear what I've left unsaid. I had written that line one night after Lucy had stopped by to bring me soup. She hadn't known then that I was feeling particularly worn down. I hadn't said anything. But she had placed her hand on mine before leaving and said, "I see you, Grandma." And she'd meant it. In the letter, I told her the story of that day. How those words had filled a hollow I hadn't realized was so deep. How, in the soft and ordinary rhythm of our visits, she had offered something I'd been missing for years, recognition without expectation. I wrote, "You never asked what you stood to gain. You asked what you could do. You never treated me like a checklist or a burden. You made me feel present, even when others were preparing for me to be gone." There was a line I had rewritten more than any other. "I didn't choose you over your mother. I chose you because you saw me." When Lucy reached that sentence, she paused. She looked around the kitchen, the chipped blue tile on the backsplash, the humming refrigerator, the small note I'd once taped above the sink that said, "You don't have to finish the dishes." To have earned your rest, I'd left it there after she did the washing up one evening without being asked. She folded her arms on the table and rested her forehead there, not crying exactly, just breathing it all in. The rest of the letter continued in that same tone, gentle but unflinching. I told her stories I hadn't shared before, about how I'd sat through long nights with her mother's colic when she was an infant, about how I'd worked double shifts at the library in the early years to cover expenses, about how, over time, I began to feel like a footnote in my own family's life someone mentioned, but not seen. Until her. "This house is yours not because you earned it with gestures," I wrote, "but because you filled it with attention. You noticed when I was quiet. You asked the kinds of questions that made me feel like a person, not a project. That's rare, Lucy. It's the kind of rare that can't be taught." At the bottom of the 3rd page, I had left a message for whenever she felt unsure about the gift toward the burden of the house. Let it be a place that reminds you that presence matters. Let it be a place that stays open to books, to laughter, to quiet. You don't have to preserve it. Just honor it. And if someday it feels too heavy, it's okay to let it go. Legacy isn't brick and mortar. It's memory. And you carry mine already. Lucy read the last line slowly. "I loved you, not for what you did, but for how you stayed." She folded the letter neatly with a reverence she didn't have to be taught. Then she got up, poured herself a glass of water, and walked through the house, touching small things along the way. A framed photo, a stack of recipe cards, the arm of the chair I always sat in to read. In the living room, she found Alan standing in the doorway. "You read it?" he said softly. She nodded. "What did she say?" Lucy looked back at the envelope, now resting beside her book. She said, "I saw her." Alan crossed the room and sat beside her on the couch. He didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The letter wasn't about instruction or inheritance or obligation. It was about witness, about the sacredness of being seen while you're still here. Lucy didn't frame the letter. She didn't tuck it away in a drawer. Instead, she placed it in the back of a book I had once loaned, Hertha's Secret Garden. She said it felt right there, quiet, tucked between pages that spoke of things blooming where no one expected. Because that's what the letter was, something blooming, something left behind, not for show, but for truth. And in her hands, it would live. The thing about Carla was that she had always assumed Not out of malice, not even out of entitlement, exactly. It was more subtle than that, like a background hum she never noticed but expected to always be there. She assumed the house would be hers, that decisions would pass through her hands first, that titles and roles meant affection would be automatic. Even as I grew quieter, more reserved, she mistook my silence for agreement. My reluctance for approval, but assumptions are a fragile currency. They only hold power until the moment they're challenged. 3 days after the will reading, Carla tried to regain control. She called Mr. Halpern's office again, this time not to clarify, but to contest. "I just want to understand what happened," she told his assistant, her voice cool and clipped. "There must have been an error." There are HADN single quotes to Mr. Halpern explained the legality of everything in plain, deliberate words. The revision had been properly filed. The witnesses had been present. The statement of intent had been read and recorded. There was no loophole, no vague clause to twist. Still, Carla pressed. She wasn't in her right mind, she argued. She'd been talking about pain, about forgetting things. She probably didn't even know what she was signing. Mr. Halpern, who had met with me twice, each time more lucid than the last, didn't raise his voice. She was clear. He said simply, and firm in her wishes. Carla didn't accept it. She went home and called Alan. "I'm not trying to take anything from Lucy," she said, "but it's not right. That house was supposed to stay in the family. I'm her daughter." Alan paused before answering. "And Lucy is her granddaughter." "I'm her child," Carla snapped. "And you weren't there?" Alan said, not unkindly. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Carla didn't call again after that. At least not for a while. What she did instead was what people do when they don't know how to grieve something that's still breathing. She turned inward. She withdrew from the family group chat. She skipped Lucy's next school event. When Alan called to check in, she was busy on the other line or just didn't pick up at all. Lucy noticed, of course, but she didn't chase. "She's figuring out how to be wrong," Lucy said one evening as she stirred a pot of soup on my old stovetop. "It takes some people longer." The house was quiet that night, still mostly untouched. My books still lined the shelves. My handwriting still labeled the spice jars. But things were beginning to shift. Not in decoration, but in rhythm. Lucy was filling the space in small, thoughtful ways. A new plant by the window, a string of postcards above the desk. Her life unfolding around the one I had finished. Alan helped her set up a file folder for taxes and repairs. He taught her how to read utility bills. She took notes. Meanwhile, Carla stewed at work. She mentioned to a colleague that she'd been overlooked in her own mother's will, hoping for outrage. Instead, the woman asked, "Were you close?" Carla paused, then changed the subject. In quiet moments, alone in her kitchen, she began replaying conversations, real and imagined. She tried to think back to the last time we had sat and talked without tension. She couldn't remember. Tried to recall the last time she had asked me about what I wanted, not what was convenient, or safe, or reasonable, but what I truly desired. For my final years, that memory too was missing. That was the beginning of her unraveling. It didn't happen dramatically. There was no breakdown, no tears in a parking lot. But slowly she began to feel the gap between who she believed she had been in my life and who she had actually become. She dug through old emails, found my last birthday message to her, read it more than once, trying to decipher if there was resentment tucked between the lines. There wasn't, just warmth and restraint. In the middle of the night, she opened her own childhood photo album and saw it differently for the first time. Not as a story of a happy family frozen in time, but as proof of a love that had once been effortless, now strained. She reached out to Lucy eventually, not with a grand gesture, just a message. "If you ever want to talk, I'd like to." About everything. Lucy didn't reply right away. She let it sit, like a seed, waiting to see if it was meant to bloom or just be buried. Carla wasn't ready yet. That was clear. But something had shifted. A fracture, acknowledged, because the truth had arrived, dressed in ink and paper, and it wasn't going back. And now, in the quiet wake of it all, Carla faced the hardest inheritance of all. Reflection, not. Wealth, not property, but the reckoning that comes when the story you told yourself no longer matches the one left behind. After the reading, after the letter, after the silence between Carla and the rest of us stretched thin enough to feel permanent, something unexpected began to happen. People started showing up not in droves, not with casseroles or sympathy cards, but in small, quiet ways, one by one. The first was Mrs. Inez Fletcher, who had lived 2 blocks over from me for more than 30 years. She showed up at the house one Saturday morning with a bundle of fresh mint wrapped in a paper towel and a worn envelope in her purse. "I found this after your grandmother passed," she told Lucy. "Your grandma lent it to me years ago. Recipe for her lemon balm tea. I never gave it back." Lucy smiled, unfolded the note. It was in my handwriting. Course it was. She wrote a little story in the margin, Inez said, about how she first tasted lemon balm as a girl in a garden she wasn't supposed to be in. Lucy laughed. "Sounds exactly like her." Inez reached for Lucy's hand, her fingers dry and warm. "She helped me through a dark time," she said. "Never told anyone. Brought soup. Walked with me. Talked to me like I still mattered. She had a quiet way of saving people. Were followed. Earl from the community center stopped by one afternoon with a watercolor wrapped in newspaper. A gentle, washed-out image of trees in early spring. "She taught me how to paint light," he said. "But more than that, she reminded me I still had hands that could do something beautiful." Lucy unwrapped the painting and placed it on the mantel. Then came Gloria, the former librarian. Then Sheila from the Tuesday art class. Then Alan's old high school friend who confessed that I once sat beside his mother at a court hearing when no one else would. Each person brought something. A memory, a story, a kindness, received quietly, without fanfare. None of them mentioned Carla. Not because they were cruel, but because, in truth, she hadn't been there. Not for the visits. Not for the hard years. Not for the small invisible acts that had filled the space of my life when family stopped noticing. Alan noticed, though. He'd always known. One evening, as Lucy and Alan sat on the front porch, watching dusk gather in the garden, he said softly, "You know what I think Mom believed in more than anything else?" Lucy looked up. "Continuity," he said. She believed things mattered because someone remembered, because someone saw. Lucy nodded. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "About how people confuse inheritance with possession. But what Mom gave, what Grandma gave, was never really about things. It was about being part of a thread." Kay Allen looked out at the street lamp just flickering on. Kayla thought she was the thread. But she never tied herself to anything. Lucy said, "Not really." The next day, Lucy started a notebook. A simple spiral-bound one she found in the drawer beside the fridge. At the top, she wrote people who showed up. Then she began listing names. Not just the ones who had visited, but people who had mattered in other ways. People I had mentioned over the years. People who had taught me something or helped me through something or simply sat beside me on a hard day. She wrote a sentence for each. Just one. A memory. A thank-you. It was something I had meant to do myself years ago, but time, as always, got in the way. Now, Lucy was continuing it. Not because she had to, because she understood the community had always known more than they said. They saw Carla's absences. Her careful distance. They noticed when she showed up only for photo ops, only when the schedule allowed. And now, in the gentle aftermath of truth, they came forward not to shame. Not to scold, but to bear witness. Because what we leave behind isn't only in the documents. It's in the quiet nods of neighbors. In the warmth of soup delivered without being asked. In paintings, letters, stories, scrawled in margins. Carla had asked once, why didn't she say anything? She had just not in the language Carla was. Used to hearing she said it in Tuesday mornings. in tea bags packed carefully for sick friends, in cards mailed on time, in chairs pulled close. And now that story was being told piece by piece by the ones who had listened all along. There were things I never said aloud. Not because I didn't know how, but because silence sometimes felt more honest than explanation. Some truths are too finely threaded to speak without unraveling something else. Carla asked once, long before the will, long before the letter, "Were you ever proud of me?" We were sitting in the backyard, the light slanting through the trees, and I was trimming lavender from the garden bed. I remember the way she asked it, not softly, not vulnerably. It came out as a challenge, sharp around the edges. I looked at her, saw the tension in her jaw, the way she braced herself for something she'd already decided would hurt. I told her, of course. She nodded, but I think she knew I had hesitated. It's just long enough for the answer to sting. But here's what I would have said if we'd had the kind of relationship where saying everything didn't feel like crossing a minefield. Yes, I was proud of you. I was proud of the little girl who held my hand too tightly in parking lots, who read books far above her grade level, who once stood up for a boy being bullied on the school bus without caring what anyone thought. I was proud of the woman who rebuilt herself after her marriage ended, who got up every day and worked, who raised Lucy to be the kind of person I wished the world had more of. But I was also disappointed. Not in who you became, but in what you chose to stop seeing. You stopped asking how I was. You assumed, you managed. You made decisions in your head before we ever spoke. And over time, I shrank. I became the thing you organized around, not the person you knew. That's what I didn't say. What I also didn't say, what I should have, was that I forgave you for it long before the will changed. Because I understood, in my quiet way, that people grow around their fear. You had watched me age, falter, forget things. You saw your own future in me, and it scared you, so you tried to get ahead of it, tried to build barriers against grief by being prepared. But preparedness isn't the same as presence, and presence is all I ever wanted. There were other things I left unsaid, tucked between pages of books and behind locked drawers. I never told Lucy how deeply her visits soothed me, how the sight of her sitting cross-legged on the living room rug filled the house with a warmth I thought I'd forgotten. I never told Alan how often I replayed the sound of his voice on the phone, steady, kind. How much I relied on his quiet consistency even when I said I was fine. I never told Carla that I kept every letter she wrote me from summer camp. Even the one where she called me the meanest mom ever for making her go. They're all in a box, labeled like the others. Letters from Carla. Because I loved her, always. That too went unspoken in the ways that matter most. But love, I've learned, doesn't always travel neatly from one generation to the next. Sometimes it skips a step. Sometimes it takes root in the soil left behind and blooms elsewhere. In Lucy, it bloomed not because she tried to earn it, but because she allowed it, sat with it, watered it with attention, not ambition. There were moments in my last year, quiet ones, at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, when I thought about calling Carla just to say something simple. I miss you, but I never did. Not because I didn't feel it, but because I didn't think she'd hear it the way I meant it. And in the end, I think she heard it anyway. In the footnote, in the letter, in the silence that followed, what was left unsaid still spoke. Because absence, too, is a kind of language, and sometimes says everything. The memorial was quiet by design. No formal service, no slideshow of photos set to soft music. Just a gathering of people who had known me in the ways that mattered. Neighbors, friends, former students, fellow artists from the community center. Alan hosted it in the backyard, beneath the tall oaks I had planted with Frank when we first bought the house. The grass was damp from morning rain, but the sky had cleared by noon. A few folding chairs, a long table with lemonade and small sandwiches. Nothing elaborate. Just what I would have wanted. Lucy stood near the back porch, the envelope with my letter still tucked into the back pocket of her notebook. She hadn't read from it in public. She said she didn't need to. It wasn't a eulogy, was a conversation. Between us, one that had already said what needed to be said. Still, everyone looked to her when the murmuring began to fade. When the rustling of cups and plates gave way to the hush of expectation. She didn't step up to a podium or clear her throat. She just spoke. My grandmother didn't believe in grand gestures, she said. She believed in noticing, in small things, in showing up. That was it, and somehow it was enough. Later, people shared their own stories. Mrs. Fletcher told the story of the lemon balm recipe again. Sheila talked about how I used to pack extra brushes in case someone forgot theirs. Earl described the day I brought coffee for the whole art class. Just because it was raining. They remembered the way I tilted my head when I listened. The way I signed every holiday card by hand, even the ones with arthritis in my fingers. The way I sat quietly beside people without needing to fix anything. No one mentioned my estate. No one referenced the will. Not out of discomfort, but because it wasn't the story they had come to tell. What mattered that day was not what I left behind in money or property, but what I'd given in presence. Carla stood at the edge of the group. She hadn't spoken much. She wore a gray dress and carried a purse too small to hold anything useful. At one point, she approached Lucy, not with dramatics, just a few steps forward. A pause. I didn't know how much I didn't know, she said. Lucy nodded. I didn't either, till I started listening. They stood that way for a moment. No hugging, no performance. Just a people facing something they couldn't change. Both trying to carry it differently. Alan placed a small stone beneath the oak tree, with my name carved into it, nothing elaborate. Just a clean etching, Marion Elwood. 1946 to 2024, still. Watching, it had been a joke between us. Years ago, I told him that when I was gone, I wanted people to behave in my house as if I were still watching, just for the sake of decency. He remembered Dot as the guests began to drift away. Lucy stayed behind. She walked through the house slowly, touching the backs of chairs, straightening a photo frame, watering a plant that had started to wilt. She didn't cry. She sat in the sunroom, the last light of day catching in her hair, and opened her notebook. It's the same one where she'd written people who showed up. She turned to the final page and wrote a new heading, What She Taught Me. Without saying it, then she listed, Grace doesn't need an audience. Quiet love counts just as much as loud. Love. You can set a boundary and still be kind. Showing up doesn't always look like a rival. Legacy is not what you leave, it's how you're remembered. She closed the book gently, placed it on the side table, and looked out into the yard. It was just a house now, bricks and siding and sun-drenched windows. But to Lucy, it was also a story, a lived-in truth, a space shaped by care, not control. It didn't feel heavy. It felt whole. Dot, and somewhere in that stillness, she smiled. Because the legacy Carla had tried to claim, and Lucy had never asked for, had now become exactly what it needed to be. Not inherited, but chosen. And in that choice, a life once overlooked had been fully, finally seen.